Greetings, everybody. My name is Akram Pfizer. I'm a professor at the Lincoln Memorial University in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I'm privileged and honored that Dean Reed has asked me to do this lecture for you. It's about energy security, and it's about largely the United States, but of course, it has implications for the whole world. So, getting to the heart of the matter, the United States does not have an integrated legal approach to energy resources. It's by and large the product of history, compromises, and some difficulties brought about by jurisdictional issues. As you all know, the United States is a federal country, and as a result, there's a division of powers between the federal government of the United States, the government of the United States, and state and local governments. So, as the professor Gilles Surgeon has noted, right, the United States, just like all developed countries and developing countries, struggles with what's called the energy trilemma. And so the energy trilemma posits that there is a need for energy security, in other words, having security of access for obvious reasons, right? And the United States has had some traumas with that, for example, in the 1970s when there was the first Arab oil embargo that followed the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. It also was worsened after the Shah of Iran was removed by the Iranian Revolution in 1979. That also led to a huge spike in prices and in a problem with energy access, right? So the energy trilemma, the first thing it points out is we need energy security. And so the United States governments have focused on how do we have a secure access to energy to fuel the American economy and American households. The second aspect of it is energy equity. How do we get energy at the right price point so that the vast bulk of American households and businesses can afford energy, right? In other words, energy being a commodity has an inelastic demand curve, which in turn means a small increase in energy supply leads to a dramatic drop in price. And that is seen by the United States government as a favorable situation, recognizing that for some of the states that produce energy and some of the energy companies, it's not always ideal. And then finally, we need to have, right, energy sustainability. This is a little more controversial in the United States than it is for those of you in Western Europe. As Americans, I think, struggle with the idea at times that there's a benefit of energy conservation in terms of leading to fewer CO2 emissions that cause global warming. Okay? So, in other words, the trilemma has to be satisfied. Energy security of access. Typically, in the United States, Republican presidential administrations have focused on this. Energy equity for households, in other words, lower price points to make it more affordable for all American households. That tends to slightly be a bigger priority for Democratic presidential administrations. And then finally, reducing aggregate emissions to protect against global climate change. That is more so a priority for Democratic administrations, but as you all probably know, it is not a sufficient priority for most of America's allies. So the challenge for the US is to achieve all three, okay? Now, the reality is, how do we reduce energy consumption consistent with sustainability? Because the difficulty is right now, more energy, right, fuels the economy, and it's hard to reduce energy consumption without reducing consumer demand and industrial potential, right? Also, another problem is many energy intensive industries such as steel, right, and coal mining have a huge salience politically within the US, right? You deal with that issue sometimes, right? For example, in Germany, the coal industry was important politically for a long time. And you've dealt with that issue, for example, in Portugal and Spain as well. But energy industrial industries such as steel and coal, right, especially with the American system of two senators per state and the electoral college, makes it difficult to reduce energy consumption. Okay? Now, with respect to security, right, the reality is today the United States is a net energy exporter, and there currently is security of access. Okay, and that is facilitated by the fact that there is offshore petroleum in the Gulf of Mexico, in conjunction with fracking and other sources of oil, as well as hemispheric access to energy from allied countries, Canada. Okay? Okay. But it's of course not guaranteed, right? For example, one of the concerns is the world price, right, affects energy equity. And for example, a problem like Russia going offline due to sanctions because of its invasion of Ukraine, or for example, the economic collapse of Venezuela brought about by the Chavez followed by Maduro regimes, right, has affected a major hemispheric source of petroleum for energy security. Another aspect of energy security for the United States is, right, continued security for the oil-rich monarchies in the Persian Gulf that increasingly are teetering in terms of authoritarianism. We see this with the regime of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and the difficulty, of course, of keeping the Arab populations on the American side in their dispute with Iran, in view of the American historical alliance with Israel that many Arabs take issue with. Okay? So the US today has, as we talked about, very, very strong security of energy access. We have coal, we have renewables, we have oil. The difficulty, one additional difficulty beyond what I just said, is electricity distribution tends to be creaky in the United States, and that leads to problems. In other words, electricity distribution is done by about 3,000 local utilities nationwide, right, that are under very lax federal regulation. The regulation we're going to talk about soon is by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but it doesn't have a sufficient workforce to adequately supervise the distribution of power by these 3,000 local utilities, right? Beyond that, these utilities tend to be kind of local welfare states whose priority quite often is maintaining their workforce, or maintaining the employment of, right, as opposed to, right, modernizing their plant equipment and distribution lines, right? And so there's a complex energy system, right? One example was in February 2021, there was the major polar vortex that led to a collapse in Texas's energy grid. So the United States has three major energy grids, power grids. There's the eastern and western interconnections, and then there's the ERCOT, right? Which applies to Texas. That's Texas energy grid, which is separated from the eastern and western interconnections because Texas doesn't want to be under the regulatory jurisdiction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so one of the things that FERC does is it requires, for example, utility lines and power equipment to be weatherized to deal with, right, extreme cold events. Texas didn't want those regulations because they're expensive to implement. The problem is in this very rare moment that led to this polar vortex, there were extremely cold temperatures that led to a collapse in the Texas's power grid, and Texas, because it was separated from the eastern and western interconnects, couldn't get access to the rest of the power grid in the nation. And this led to a huge problem as many households lacked power in extremely cold weather, right? The failure was largely because Texas, which was not under FERC regulation, right? They didn't have properly insulated power facilities, right? And so as demand went up, they went offline, right? The similar problem happened during very high temperatures in both Texas and California in 2021, right? In other words, when there's very, very high temperatures, there's a massive spike in demand for electricity because people want more air conditioning. And the problem is if there's even warmer temperatures than usual, perhaps due to global climate change, as manifested in higher temperatures locally, right? That could lead to a massive spike that a creaky grid may not be able to sustain. That happened in the United States too. The reality is the problems related to global climate change can be very, very expensive, and they're not being adequately addressed by the quality of the grid that distributes electricity from the generation facilities, like, for example, a coal-fired power plant, a wind plant, a solar plant, or a nuclear plant, to households, okay? So there is a racial component to this in the United States, as well as a socioeconomic component, right? In Texas, predominantly white areas had an approximately 11% chance of experiencing a power outage, while non-white areas had a 47% chance, okay? So what are the causes of these outages? I think the fundamental reason for them is, right, a creaky grid, okay, and creaky infrastructure that is run at the local level in conjunction with higher temperatures and more extreme temperatures that lead to spikes in demand that the grids can't accommodate, okay? And that's a problem because there is security in terms of energy access, but not security in terms of energy distribution in the United States, okay? So what's the distinction between energy law and environmental law? Energy law is framed by physical characteristics of the country's energy sources and systems, by the markets that value and distribute them, and by the policies that shape them. Unlike environmental law, energy law's primary focus is on providing reliable, affordable energy. It covers extraction and transport of energy resources, electricity production and transmission, and the transport of goods and people. It also focuses on market regulations to avoid government price setting. Environmental law, by contrast, focuses on addressing pollution and on conserving and protecting key natural resources. It also increasingly focuses on protecting against climate change, okay? And now that's kind of the rub we're getting at, right? Because the average American household generates about 18 tons of carbon per year for a high level of economic activity, right? So the energy system, right? The key to the economies of Western Europe and the United States, its primary systems are coal, natural gas, oil, nuclear, and renewables, okay? Its secondary systems use these energy resources to provide electricity and transport. More so than in Western Europe, fossil fuel resources and sources dominate the US energy system, with 79% of the primary energy consumed coming from oil, natural gas, and coal. You know, by way of example, in much of Western Europe, there is much greater use of nuclear energy. The remaining 21% comes from renewables, a third of which comes from wind and solar, which is greater than hydropower. Okay, that's the energy system in the United States. Now, oil currently provides nearly all transport-related energy in the US. Now, that's changing because of, for example, right, electricity cars like the problem with things like the Tesla, though, right, is the Tesla and electricity cars, they tend to be very good quality, but they are at a very high price point for most American households. So the American household remains inordinately focused on oil consumption, or petroleum consumption. And the difficulty is this: as the oil price tends to come down with greater sources of energy, right? What tends to happen in American households is they tend to buy bigger, more oil consuming vehicles like pickup trucks and SUVs that in turn, right, require more energy access or more energy consumption, which comes at the expense potentially of energy security, but more likely energy conservation. The electricity sector can be divided into residential, commercial, and industrial. Problematically, fossil fuels comprise the lion's share of global greenhouse gas emissions, most notably CO2. Okay? So one of the things we have to do in the United States, as well as Western Europe, in view of the very high level of human development in both parts of the world, is find a way to shift to renewables uh, from uh, from fossil fuel sources of energy. The reality is The United States produce American households use typically more than 3 times as much energy per household as compared to Western European countries, high-income countries, for example, such as France, the United Kingdom, Germany. And the reality is that is an excessive consumption by American households. All right. So U.S. oil production, by way of example, has gone up due to deep water drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Okay, the problem, though, is deep water drilling, which is largely done in the Gulf of Mexico, is petroleum that requires a high level of refining. So compared to oil that's taken from, for example, Algeria or North Africa, like many Western European countries use, or the Persian Gulf, right? Oil taken from the Gulf of Mexico, or for example, drilling in the Canadian tar sands, requires a very, very high level of refining. So the carbon footprint of it is very high. The other problem is fracking, right? Tends to use scarce drinking water. It also, at times, if not properly done, can lead to earthquakes and tremors. And finally, it generates very polluting methane, which is problematic. Okay. That said, oil imports have been reduced, and as of 2020, the United States became a oil exporting country. It's one of the major oil exporting countries today is the United States. Okay? But there's strategic challenges, right? So for example, the global economy requires energy from the Persian Gulf and North Africa, and those are, for example, at times, not always the most politically stable regions, right? We talked about it. The United States has long sought to maintain good relations with the oil-rich monarchies, which has sometimes come into conflict with American domestic political support for Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, okay? Right? So this leads the US to spend more than other rich countries on its military and make cyber attacks on energy facilities such as the May 2021 Colonial Pipeline attack more likely. Increasingly, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran has sought to be involved in cyber attacks on our energy infrastructure, partly from their perspective in retaliation for our attempts to keep them from having access to a nuclear weapon or nuclear facilities. You all know that issue, okay? So one of the tensions in the United States is the tension between centralization and decentralization, right? Electricity provision has historically been seen as a natural monopoly without local competition, right, in a particular physical area due to the high cost of generation plants, transmission lines, and distribution networks. This is increasingly outdated, okay? So the most important agencies we have in the United States, at the end of the day, are they have different competencies, but we in the United States lack a single entity responsible for dealing with the energy trilemma. And that may be something we need. Right now we have the US Department of Energy, right, which that has energy labs, right, that we also have, right, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Both the DOE and FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, were created by Congress during the Carter administration in 1977. And they both were in response, right, to the Arab oil embargo, okay, of 1973 that led to a collapse in energy access and a spike in prices. We have the Department of the Interior. Now, the Department of the Interior, their large goal basically is managing all the land owned by the United States, largely west of the Mississippi River. But it's important because it issues leases to energy companies, right, to at times drill for energy sources such as gas and oil. And then we have the Environmental Protection Agency, which is an agency, and the EPA administrator is a member of the president's cabinet, and the EPA is there to protect the environment from excessive energy consumption, okay? Finally, we have the Department of Transportation. Their big job in the United States really is dealing with interstate highways, right, and highway planning. But they also are relevant in setting fuel economy standards and funding and facilitating the transition to electric vehicles, okay? Right now, the problem, though, is electric vehicles are there, they're increasingly used, but they're very expensive, okay? So keep that in mind. Those are major administrative agencies that we have. As I said, the problem is, though, we don't have a single agency in this competency, okay? Now, with respect to state law, state public utility commissions play crucial roles in regulating utilities, but the problem is typically it's regulation with a light touch, and the utilities' primary focus tends to be keeping their workforce employed, which comes at the expense quite often on using their revenues to enhance the quality of the grid, okay? So, right, Dean Reed will be giving you some of my slides that will be useful in some administrative law basics to go on, right? So American energy reliance has shifted over time between coal to natural gas, a shift that has been facilitated by government policies of the Obama and Biden administrations and delayed, I would say, by the second Bush and Trump administrations. I think the reason is largely domestic politics. Republican administrations such as the second Bush administration and the Trump administration tended to get more political support from the oil and gas lobby than Democratic administrations. Okay? Fossil fuel and renewable energy production has been bolstered by technological developments. The problem is this, right? Is renewables, you can generate solar power while the sun is shining, you could generate wind power while the wind is blowing, but if neither is happening, those sources tend to go offline. And the difficulty we have right now is we don't have means of energy capture or storage. In other words, to get to the grid, we need contemporaneous sources of energy generation, but only so much power can only access the grid without overwhelming it. And we can't store excess power effectively outside of that. And we haven't found a way about energy capture in any economically feasible way to this date, okay? So as I said, we have three grids, right? The Eastern, Western, and we have the ERCOT grids in the United States, and we have a separate grid for Alaska and Hawaii as well, right? And what FERC has done, and this is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it has required, based on the Federal Power Act, it has required energy companies, and you'll see in the slides and in the case I present called New York v. FERC, which is a 2002 case from the Supreme Court. It requires now energy companies, right, to the grid to not just, and the utility companies that own the grid to allow energy generators to transmit on the grid as well. And that the idea behind that is you have more sources of energy and it will reduce prices. It also, right, facilitates security of access because you have more sources of energy on the grid. Okay, and that's New York v. FERC. Okay, another case I show you is the zero zone case, and here where we see it's an example of how the United States Department of Energy has broad regulatory power to implement energy efficiency standards on refrigerators, for example, right? And that's, I think you'll find that of interest. Okay, and right. Then I'm going to show you the Massachusetts v. EPA case in my slides. And that case is relevant because it demonstrates how for a long time the government refused to acknowledge that carbon was a pollutant, right? That was a pollutant subject to EPA regulations. And for obvious reasons, a lot of people didn't want to have to deal with that, the problem. And Massachusetts v. EPA is an example of the US Supreme Court using its power of judicial review to mandate that the government and that the EPA regulate carbon as a pollutant, right? Because the government's position as of 2007 was that carbon is not a regulable pollutant like, for example, smoke, okay? And that, I think, is a useful case for you to look at, okay? Now, I think another thing I want you to see here is is the case that we have, for example, is the West Virginia v. EPA case, which is a case where, for example, the Obama administration, in trying to reduce energy emissions, right, and bring the country into compliance, or somewhat facilitate American compliance with the Paris Climate Agreement. Remember, the Paris Climate Agreement basically said rich countries such as the United States would agree to reduce emissions, right, in conjunction with developing countries, and provide technology transfers and economic assistance to developing countries with a goal to reduce global climate change, contain them to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? Part of that was plan to reduce emissions, okay? One thing the Obama administration did for that is it had its EPA, right, issue regulations, right, that required generation shifting, right, at the grid level to transition from high to low emitting producers. So in other words, what it said is EPA required, right, stationary sources of pollution, right, when they needed a new permit to shift from, for example, coal-fired power plants that are the most CO2 polluting, right, to natural gas-fired plants, which are less polluting, and then from natural gas-fired plants to renewables, right, like such as solar and wind. And the idea behind that was, if you shift that way over time, you dramatically reduce emissions, because stationary sources of pollution, right, account for a full 30% of American emissions, right? But the Supreme Court said the EPA didn't have statutory authority to do this because EPA had never done this before, right? Now, that's a dubious piece of logic, and from my view, because just because you've never done something before doesn't mean you weren't allowed to do it before, right? Like, for example, I haven't gone bungee jumping in my life. That doesn't mean I'm disallowed from bungee jumping. That makes sense? And so the court made this rule applying an administrative law concept called the major questions doctrine, saying that it will interpret congressional intent itself and not defer to the agency. And that's the West Virginia v. EPA case, right? Now, since that decision, right, the Biden administration has chosen to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement, which focuses on limiting temperature rises based on the nationally determined contributions to reduce carbon emissions, right? This was negotiated by the Obama administration, which never submitted it to the US Senate for ratification, but implemented the Clean Power Plan as its means of satisfying the nationally determined contributions. In other words, each country had to make a contribution to reduce its emissions. The Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the agreement and sought to rescind the Clean Power Plan with what it called the ACE rule, right? And the Biden administration is working on its own energy rule and its Build Back Better program, which became the Inflation Reduction Act, provided subsidies to renewable energy. Okay, I think the thing that has to be said is, from a European perspective, the United States is consuming too much energy to properly send the didactic message, not only to Western Europe, but to Eastern Europe and the developing world about reducing emissions in an aggregate sense, right? It's hard to tell the Chinese government that it should reduce emissions when Americans individually generate about 18 tons of carbon per person. More problematically, right, the means we have for measuring individual emissions per country are kind of misleading, in the sense that the emissions are charged by where the product is produced as opposed to where it's consumed. So, for example, if I go to the store and I buy a pair of Nike sneakers that are made in China or Vietnam, even though it's consumed by me here in the United States, it's considered a Chinese or a Vietnamese emission, not an American emission. Similarly, if I buy a t-shirt at Uniqlo that's consumed by me here, but made in Vietnam, it's considered a Vietnamese emission, not a US emission. And so that's another asymmetry. Okay? So the strengths of the US energy system are that security of access now. Americans are very resilient and innovative in finding ways of capturing energy and finding sources of energy. That is the strength. There are weaknesses, though, right? We lack a centralized energy to help with conservation and security. The US's energy priorities tend to be undermined by lack of effective government capacity. There's a failure to take needed steps to protect against climate change or reduce emissions by implementation of a carbon tax, right? So it comes as no secret to those of you in Western Europe, but the price of petroleum in the United States is significantly less than it is in Western European countries such as Portugal, France, or Germany. And that leads Americans, that's one of the factors that leads Americans to consume dramatically more energy. Other factors include, for example, a dispersed population, lack of, in many American cities, of public transport to reduce energy consumption per head, and also, of course, excessive reliance on automobiles as a means of transport by American households, such as my own. Okay? The U.S. need for energy to stability often comes at the expense of human rights and democratization, right? As we talked about, right? For example, the United States sends a lot of military assistance, right, to, for example, Persian Gulf states, Arab states. It sends a lot of military assistance, right? For example, to Israel. I'm not telling you how to feel about the Arab-Israeli dispute, but those are the things that come into question. And US per capita emissions are very high compared to Western Europe, right? Right now, it's about 17 to 18 tons, right, by each American compared to 5 tons for each Frenchman, less than 5 tons for each Portuguese person, 4.7 tons for Switzerland. And, Switzerland has actually higher income per head than the United States. So that's a staggering discrepancy. And of course, my country of origin, Sri Lanka, only produces 0.86 tons per person. Okay? So these are the challenges going forward. How does the US encourage global CO2 emission reductions globally when its own population consumes huge amounts of energy, right? How does the government encourage conservation by its own population that prioritizes consumer spending over conservation, right? I think one of the real difficulties in the United States, we see it in our political dysfunction. The American public is unwilling to compromise and tends to vote out of office presidents that seek compromise, right? The obvious example I can give to this is President Carter, who brought in the energy agencies that we just talked about. Well, he lost a landslide to Ronald Reagan in 1980, I think partly because the public didn't like the language of compromise he was asking. How does the US calibrate its own economic development such that it can generate higher human development with less resource consumption, right? So, for example, one of the great difficulties in the US is we consume a high amount of energy, but things like, for example, an energy tax, right, that could reduce consumption will have an inordinate effect on the poor and racial minorities who tend to live in areas without access to public transport and tend to use older, more energy consuming vehicles, right? How does the US reconcile the need for stable energy resources worldwide with the need for democratization and the rule of law, right? One of the challenges is going to be going forward is, from a strategic sense, is how does the US cease importing energy and the rest of the world potentially consume less? One of the difficulties could well be in the Persian Gulf is how do the traditional Arab oil monarchies stay relevant? How do they avoid insurgencies without access to the oil royalties they've relied on to basically buy peace from their populations? Another security difficulty. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to getting to know all of you better. And thank you to Dean Reed. Take care.